Okay, good evening, everybody. This is Divided We Stand. It's 8:03 Eastern Time. I'm Brian Weinstein, and tonight we're going to have a special guest, including our normal co-host, David Price. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few things. If you are interested in Divided We Stand, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel and also check out our Facebook page. Our membership is growing, and we would certainly appreciate that you all get involved and make this an interactive community of like-minded people. Our guest tonight is Guy Lane. Now, I've had many guests on the Reality Report with Paul McGinley over the last 2 years. We've had Guy McPherson, Mark Andelman. We've had Nathan Goldschmidt. David Price knows him well. He's from CERN. He's a physicist. But I think out of all the guests that we've had, no guest covers as much mental geography and actual physical geography as tonight's guest, Guy Lane. And Guy's a special guest because Guy really can cover a lot of topics, and you're going to see that tonight. And I think Guy will be the perfect guest to have a great interplay with David Price and myself, because this channel is a channel which has taken a stand. None of us, neither Dave Price nor I, am a big fan of Joe Biden, but we do know that Trump is a cancer. He's toxic and he must be terminated. Therefore, we are going to do what we have to do to get Joe Biden elected. And the majority of people on our page, you the viewer, believe the same. And I think this is the perfect guest tonight because Guy, as an author and an environmental scientist, he understands what commitment means for change and revolution, so to speak, getting things done. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce, of course, our co-host David Price and Mr. Guy Lane. Guy, it's great to see you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, it's wonderful having you again. We haven't seen you for a while. It's been about 6-7 months, but it's great to see you back, and we see you in your Prius, which is also entitled Motel Prius in your latest book.
Yes,
Yeah.
Motel Prius,
Right.
my home at the moment.
Right. And with us also is David Price, who normally is in Arlington, Virginia, but tonight he is not too far from where I am. He's from Vineland, New Jersey.
Yes, I'm in a very scenic Holiday Inn room, and this is the first time I've been out of the D.C. area since March 11th lockdown. So it's brand new, but here we are broadcasting from the Holiday Inn.
Right. So, in any case, Guy, as I mentioned in the introduction, this page, this channel, and again, it's not just a Facebook page, it's a YouTube channel, and you're live on Facebook, on YouTube, on Periscope, and actually in Russia tonight.
Okay.
But I would like for you to comment about this idea of, even though you don't have everybody together completely as a majority, so to speak, how effective can groups, say, like Divided We Stand, be in a situation where you don't get all the support that you need in your efforts to win, but you know that it's necessary? I'm wondering if you can make a comment on that, Guy.
Yeah, so I had some involvement with the Extinction Rebellion, not in any organizing capacity, but as somebody that just probed in to try and understand it. And one of the rationales of the Extinction Rebellion movement was that if you look at nonviolent rebellions over the last 200 years, none of them failed when you had 3.5% of the public actively involved in the rebellion. And so that suggests that you only need a small proportion of the public to have a very, very firmly fixed and clearly enunciated position that will actually carry into in this instance political power.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was based on the academic research by I think Erica Chenoweth was the name of the academic, and that work was promoted by Roger Hallam, who was one of the architects of the Extinction Rebellion movement. And And so that's an interesting number, because 3.5% suggests you've got 65+% of the public, 96% of the public sitting at home watching the rebellion take place on the television, not having an opinion whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and yet the rebels still get away and get to change the society. What I've observed about the deployment of that idea is that you don't want to be alienating the 90%. You don't want to have 96% of people opposing the rebels. Okay, and this is something that happened in Brisbane, where there was a lot of young people got involved in Extinction Rebellion and sort of managed to put the city offside, and that didn't help them at all. So anyway, so I mean, it's just the idea that you don't need to have 80% of the public on board an idea for that idea to carry.
Thank you. You know, we see Trump. Dave and I both agree, and Dave, you can chime in whenever you like. That we see Trump as such a toxic element in this country that at this point in time, we think that people need to coalesce, forget about third-party candidates, and just say, hey, look, there's a job to be done. And at some point, you've got to hold your nose and say, okay, Biden might not be perfect, but at this point in time, if you're trying to save the country, if not the planet, the correct choice is to say, look, we've got to take care of the top thing first, and that is Trump. Now, would you agree with that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think your system basically doesn't have room for a third party, and your democratic system seems to have chosen Joe Biden. So it's not like you've actually got there really is a third choice. I mean, conceivably, this Kane West character comes in and lots of people could vote for him. But, I think your strategy is correct. If you can get Biden in, then at least you got rid of Trump. And then he's got to deal with Biden. And I don't think Biden's going to... I mean, what we need to do in order to prevent the runaway greenhouse effect and the extinction of life on Earth is a radical transformation of our energy systems, and Biden's not going to bring that in. Okay, so in a way, so you sort of like you're having to deal tactically in order you can reposition to deal with the strategy down the track. Mm-hmm. But the first thing is you've got to get Trump out. There's no doubt about that. Like you say, and to use the expression cancer and toxin, I mean, these are exactly the right words to describe that guy.
Right. Dave, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, on my ride up today, I think I've been making a big mistake. And I think Donald Trump is very, very good for America. I think we should. Oh, no, fuck that. We don't do that. Listen, yes, Scott's right. What we have is this. Look, it's simple. Brian, you and I do disagree on this. I think everyone has a right to cast their vote however they want. But I think I want to make them aware that if they, we went into that in depth in some previous shows. But if you really believe that a third party candidate is your person and speaks for you, and you feel morally that you must vote for them, then do that. I mean, then you have to do that. But I think you have to do it with your eyes open. Your candidate is not going to win. It does, so you're saying, but I know that Donald Trump or Joe Biden is going to be the winner, but I just feel that I can't, in good conscience, vote for either one. I would really encourage people, this is not the time to write in Mickey Mouse, literally. That might make you feel good, but I think this election is one of those times, you could argue all elections do this, but I think even more, it's about you, your family, your community, your country, but also the world. And, if you're going to throw away your vote like that, I think you're kind of not thinking of others, and I think you should. So if you do boil it down to Donald Trump and Joe Biden, to me, I'm not even going to hold my nose. I only would hold my nose if I walk by the White House. Donald only lives 4.6 miles from me, never invites me in. I don't know why. Neither does Melania, but that's whatever it is. They just don't invite me in. I would hold my nose when I walk by and see him, if I saw him. But I don't think. I mean, again, this is what I've been. I've been following Joe Biden for years. I mean, Joe Biden was in office when I was a reporter, back in the 80s. Joe Biden basically is this. Joe Biden's a good man. He really is. Yes, he plagiarized a document in college. And yes, he's been accused a couple times of inappropriate behavior with women. And I'm not dismissing that lightly. I'm not. I'm just saying if you look at him today, and this is what I would tell people about Joe Biden, he has suffered. He knows death from his first wife. He knows it from his son. Donald Trump, the only death that Donald Trump would care about is 1 second before his own. And so really, it's a simple election. Do you want Joe Biden, who does have the ability to think and act and look after others? Or do you want Donald Trump, whose sole purpose on the planet is to benefit Donald Trump?
Right. Now, Guy,
That's simple.
you were mentioning something interesting. I was, obviously we have a major problem with the pandemic here, and even today, for example, Joe Biden started talking about the environment, how this is a way to bring jobs back. Trump has completely mishandled the environment, and you have Scott Morrison there, who normally is, at least we thought of him to be not much different than Trump. You mentioned a few things prior to coming on, but I was wondering if you could explain to our guests, why has Australia, if they have, handled the pandemic, the COVID-19 situation, better than, say, Trump has?
Well, Scott Morrison is not widely loved amongst most of the people that I talk to. But compared to Trump, we think he's pretty awesome. Now the Liberal Party, I was reading the other day, has been in power for about 2/3 of the time that Australia's been having democratic government, democratic elections, and so they've been able to build up this sort of pretty strong social networks, if you like, which keeps that when the Liberal Party comes in, that's when the big money gets to sort of have its day, and so then you got the Labor Party, which is sort of more left wing, although they're both pretty centrist, really. And anyway, so Morrison came in after a very long period of where there was just this constant turnover of the leadership in the what we call the Liberal Party, which is like the right wing, and Morrison came in, and he just wasn't particularly popular, and he's a Pentecostalist as well. And so he pals around with a guy called Brian Houston, who set up a church called Hillsong, which is one of the biggest and most prosperous of the Pentecostal churches in Australia. And Scott Morrison gets to go on stage with Brian Houston and do events, and even invited the media into the church one time so we could see him talking in tongues or speaking or praying or whatever the hell it is that they do. And so that's sort of, I think that alienates a lot of regular Australians, because most regular Australians aren't Pentecostalist Christians, and they don't like that sort of stuff. And then what happened was we had this wildfire season, which was started around about November last year, and went over about 2 or 3 months, and it was just horrendous. It was like it dominated the news cycle for 2 months. And these fires, I mean, thousands of properties, hundreds of lives. And what did Scott Morrison do? He fucked off to Hawaii on holiday with his family. Right. And that rightly got the ire of the Australian public, because these fires were just, we lost like 25% of Australia's forest went under fire, and the Prime Minister fucked off to Hawaii. Now, if he'd gone to Hamilton Island, at least he would have been keeping the money in Australia, but he didn't. He took it. Anyway, so when he nearly lost his position as a result of that. And then shortly after the fires, then COVID pops up. So I think that the government had basically been put on notice that it really needed to switch on and focus on, national calamities. And as a result, they've been extremely efficient. Not only the federal government, but because we've got states as well. The state governments have been enacting their own. The state governments look after the state health system, and then there's federal. I don't understand fully the interaction with the health care system, but there's the two layers. So the federal government, one of the things that they did was they doubled the unemployment benefits. They put in this COVID support, and because so many people lost their jobs as a result of the lockdowns, and it had been a long-standing argument in Australia that the unemployment benefits were so low that it was practically put people into poverty. So they got doubled, and so that was actually a very positive thing. I think a lot of people, considering how many people got thrown out of work, were able then to actually kind of keep going rather than getting thrown out of work and then falling into poverty and the whole life falls apart. So and then the lockdowns were kind of severe, and we've actually had border shutdowns as well. So, for example, in my car the other day, I was coming up from New South Wales. I spent 2.5 hours to get across the border into Queensland in a traffic jam, and the two-lane highway, which you'd normally sit doing 110 kilometres, actually came to a total standstill for most of that 2.5 hours. And there was a single policeman. They came down to a single file, and the policeman was checking that you had a document that you had to go online and fill in. It was basically a declaration to say that you hadn't been to one of the hotspot areas. So they've been very effective with the COVID lockdowns, and as a result, we've got very few cases and very few deaths.
Mm-hmm. But if not for the fires, do you think that Morrison would have taken the same measures with COVID if not for the fires?
Well, this is just my view. I think that the fires was a really big wake-up call. They were only in power for a little while, and I think hypothetically, if they hadn't had the fires, I'd say that they wouldn't have been so disciplined of the COVID. Mm-hmm. That's my view. That's my understanding of it. I mean, the fires was a pandemic of itself. I mean, it was a big thing in Australia. And of course, everything I talk about tends towards abrupt climate change. But we put another 30 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere since last year, and so we might not have a massive fire season again this year, but we keep priming the pump for it.
Dave, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's funny. I knew very little about Australia. It's one of the few places I haven't been. My wife and I haven't been. And we were heading there this year because, as I mentioned before in this show, our son, our daughter-in-law, and the two most important people to me, my granddaughter, Audrey, and my grandson, Owen, they'd be in school, so I'll give them a shout out. Mom and Dad will tell them when they get home. So really, I've been getting some, I don't want to say daily, but some certainly multi-weekly reports. And a lot of what you said, Guy, it is, I mean, not that you would lie, I don't be that, but it's really nice to everything you've said to be reinforced, through information I get from my family. And I think one of the big differences, and I'm going to try to put it in perspective for America, you talked about your 2-hour line, that came down. And I know Michael and Shannon, this is the first time they've really been out and about. They the same thing, they're in the capital, Canberra. But here we have so much mobility. And I think part of the problem was Trump's ineffective leadership. And I think I think there's two things that he did. I mean, there's many things he did wrong. I don't think he wanted the responsibility of really taking it on. That was part of it. And so he turned it over to the states. And then once he saw that this was going to jeopardize his reelection, and, to anyone who believes he cares anything other than about his reelection, I'm sorry, you've been conned. I'd love to tell you differently. I can't. So he'll come back. And I think, too, looking at the difference. So Australia was better at the lockdown. They were better at distance moving. And from what I've been able to determine, you didn't ridicule science. And Trump doesn't believe in anything. But Trump certainly doesn't believe in science. And he shouts out this guy, Dr. Fauci, who becomes like everybody's grandfather or, old uncle. And you really like the guy. And then he says, no, he's been talking, and talks trash. And then he brings him back because Trump messes up his. And so it's one thing to do a stop start. Now, a guy, you might want to pick up on this later. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but this is kind of brand new. Not pandemics aren't brand new. Viruses aren't brand new. But this is a brand new strain. And for example, one of the things that has really surprised most experts, a number of viruses, when it gets hot, they diminish, right? We're not finding that because we're running heat waves in Australia. So it's a virus that goes across apparently seasons. But first they said this will come down. I wish, and we can't go back. There's no time machines. The big question initially for me, we live in, like I said, Judy and I live in Washington, D.C., and we're very used to seeing Orientals, mostly students or diplomats or anyone who comes over, wearing masks in the summer. It's the ordinary. And then when I first came out, I said, and the first thing I remember, it just struck me as odd there was an article that I read, and it said, well, it's acceptable over there, but here it's not. And I'm thinking, well, it's either good science or it's not. It's not like, Australia has different science, and of course now it's been proven, but we have this macho thing, and it certainly doesn't help. I don't know how much you follow America, that Donald Trump has worn a mask, to my knowledge, twice. The first time he did not show his face with it. Whoever that was, if you got dinner, I just saw a message. Yeah, I'll stop over if you have dinner for me. Hey, Keith, how's it going?
Yes, and Keith still owes you $2,000 from Australia.
No, I like Keith. We're now Facebook friends. No, but anyway, Guy, I think just, talking about the difference in Australia, again, I have not found, I think, despite maybe some distaste, nobody seems to be disputing the science over there. And maybe, just maybe, it's certainly a tragedy almost beyond comprehension of what the fires did. However, as you pointed out, it might have just made people think, well, this is bad. And in America, we just have a third of the people who don't understand anything about other than Donald Trump was either sent by God or was declared universally to be the leader, and we will follow him. So we've got bad science here. We've got states. We've got political. That's why we call the show "Divided We Stand." There's millions of divisions here, and while there are divisions, I'm sure in Australia, it seems to be everywhere else that I've ever traveled. There seems to be more of a spirit of country than here. We really don't have that anymore. I don't know that we ever did.
Is that true, Guy?
Yeah.
In Australia?
Well, I'll just pick up on one thing. I think Trump actually wore a mask 3 times. The first time it was one of those white pointy ones.
Well, I call that a Trump hat. I'm sorry, I don't count that as that's a hat. He would actually if you ask Melania, they have a game that they do it. Well, we won't go into that. Okay, it involves that pointed hat, if you can imagine.
Yeah. Looks Australia. I think Australians. I don't know how Americans identify as Americans, but Australians identify as Australians. That's for sure. And we don't have this. I've been reading a lot about the slavery and a little bit about the Civil War and how ingrained the racism is institutionalized into the American history. So, I was reading about the founding fathers, most of whom actually kept slaves, right? And so we never had, obviously we have an Aboriginal population who were were terribly treated, broadly massacred, and largely, atrocious what we did to the Aboriginal people. But the Aboriginal people now actually kind of have got a lot of political right back, if you like. I'm gonna be careful on this subject matter, but now I think Australians broadly love the Aboriginal people and recognise that something terrible happened, and so in a way it certainly hasn't been fixed, but we don't have the big fissures in our society that I think you have in America. We've got institutionalized racism still. We've still got colonialism is well and truly established. It hasn't yet been taken away. And we don't have a proper conversation about that. I'm sort of left of center, but I've only actually really understood colonialism in the last couple of years of my life. I've only been around people that are talking about it and helping me understand it and what it was and how it still is. But we don't have the stress fractures that you've got in America. We don't have, we've got a liberal party, which is kind of like the Republican Party, but they're not as, they're not as crazy as your people over there. So, and we've got a smaller population as well. So we've got about 25 million people, and it's a big country. I mean, it's a lot of, most Australians are concentrated in the cities, but we just don't have lots and lots of massive cities which have run down in the middle, and we've had a relatively buoyant economy. So, they call it the lucky country, and if you look at it against many measures of human well-being, we're always up in the top 5 or 10%. So there's no threat of civil war in Australia. And yeah, I read, reading science about understanding how societies fall apart, and America seems to be teetering. Maybe not teetering on the edge, but sort of definitely. If you get Trump in for another 4 years, and
have a lot to do on how that teetering goes.
And particularly if he decides not to go, if he loses the election, I mean, you could see your country going up in flames.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, it went up in flames recently after the guy was killed.
In Minnesota,
policeman knelt on his leg with his hands in his pockets.
Right.
So anyway, yeah.
Another question I'd like to ask Guy, if I could, in my travels around the world, one of the big questions, let's say learned from America, they said we have to ask you something. Now, of course, the big question is, well, how the hell did you elect Donald Trump? But the one before that was about guns, and I think sometimes we underrate that, how detrimental that is in America. And Americans, this is one of my knocks on Americans, not all of them, but for the most part, they don't get to other places in the world. I can't put a percentage on it. Brian, I would guess that more than 65, maybe 70% of Americans have only two countries or three places they've been: Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands, outside of the U.S. borders, which also, I think, gives them a false sense of this U.S. exceptionalism. Right now, we are exceptional. We're exceptionally bad. And of course, that's horrific right now for these people. Number one, USA number one. And, we were, but just by default, in my estimation. I mean, I'm not a historian, but we were like really the last, what would you say? The last man or, last woman, if you want a woman to govern, last man or woman standing after World War II. And so we had to jumpstart. We had the bomb, which was not a good thing, of course, but we had it and we ran with it. And now, the idea of it truly is one world. I mean, I use this all the time. If you took away my layovers, I could be sitting in your car. If you'd leave it there for 24 hours, I could be sitting there in your car with you, basically, in the air, right? And that's just amazing. It's astounding. And we've mentioned this before, Brian, a number of times, but I think it's it. America also had a luxury prior to this. We had two of the best man-made, not man-made, not the false Mexican wall, which we should probably discuss a little bit tonight because it's falling down. What's built of it? But anyway.
Or more than likely, the Mexicans themselves will pay for the wall to keep us out.
Well, there is a wall. I mean, Canada, we just extended another 30 days where we can't move between the two countries. But my point is we had this Atlantic Ocean and we had this Pacific Ocean. And we could really stay out of things. Now, Australia has that to a certain extent. I mean, you have that. Even I'm sure, I don't know if you're familiar with it because you're so young compared to my old age, but On the Beach, the book by Neville Shute, and of course Australia, Gregory Peck characters down there waiting for it to come. And, I said, I'm going to Australia. As soon as I read that book, I said, I want to be, no. But still, I mean, it's just amazing to me, even though given, lesser population, but how well Australia and New Zealand have handled that. And I would really challenge anybody in America tonight, anyone out there, to say we are exceptional and to say we are ahead of Australia and New Zealand tonight in the pandemic. It just can't. And there's other countries. I mean, we're ranking up there with Brazil and Russia. I don't want to be with them. I want to be with you guys. I mean, in terms of that. And so what difference does that make? I think it makes the fact that two things. It's leadership, but number two, the people followed, right? Yeah. I mean, my understanding is my grandchildren, think about this. We're going to do a special show in here, everybody. It's going to be a big one. What would Trump say? It's going to be a bigly show with some very, very bigly ideas. And we're going to devote the whole show to education. Because that's the number one concern right now, past the pandemic in business, right, and politics. Talking to my grandchildren, they're back into school, no problems. They're doing a reduced day. They're doing distance learning. They're actually being very successful at it. The distance learning, I worked with some projects here in America with it. It was a abysmal failure. It was not in Australia. It certainly wasn't the same as being the first. They're there without masks. I mean, it's pretty amazing. If you come here,
It just seems so weird giving
to come here,
Scott Morrison credit for that, though. I mean, I'm not saying you
Well,
are,
here's the thing, guys.
but it
What
implies
I'd like to do, I will buy you a Prius, and you can come here, and then you can get the coronavirus as you ride through different states and report back to Australia, because they're going to forget what it is you guys have done such a great job. But anyway, it's not Praise Australia night. It's really tear down Donald Trump night. But again, let me end at this point. You've got to look, American people, and unfortunately, you're really singing to the gospel choir tonight. I wish we had, I would like to have all Trumpites on. I'd love to do that. But the idea of this is you need to look outside America to see what we didn't do right. That's very important. And we don't do that as a general rule. And you spoke of your, it's just amazing to me that today you can think, if you live in America, that Donald Trump has made America's standing in the world greater. I travel, not since the pandemic, but since he's been there. And many people are very, very kind about what they say. But basically, they're just saying, what in the hell happened to America? That's really what they're saying. And I say, would you tell me? I don't know. I mean, I do know. But
well, Guy, does Australia deserve that much credit, or is he right?
I think, look, Australia. I think Australia deserves credit, despite the fact that the Prime Minister is a Pentecostalist, which is a pretty serious thing to have in a position of power. I think, given what they believe. We've got good governance, right? And Australians, whilst they bitch and moan about governments all the time, they broadly trust the government. And we've got not only the federal, but you've got the state governments, and they're free and fair elections. And for the most part, there's some notable exceptions, but for the most part, the politicians are pretty decent people. There are some buffoons and some sociopaths, but for the most part, they're sort of reasonable people. And we've got good governance. We're well governed. We're not well governed with respect to transition away from fossil fuels and the regrowth of nature. We're poorly governed in that regard. But in terms of maintaining keeping the household, keeping the country running, we're well governed. And then you've got Trump in your country. So your nation really was going to be the leader of the world until you fucked it up, because China wasn't going to take that position, Europe wasn't going to take that position, Russia wasn't, the BRICS country, America. It was Americans to lose, and something happened in your system, and it just looks like then the wheels came off.
Well, perhaps there is an Australian tie to it. I don't want to pick on Australia, Guy, believe me. But Rupert Murdoch, obviously with Fox News has been the propaganda arm of the Republican Party and the Trump administration. And he seems to have, locked into that idea of Americans thinking that they're exceptional, that foam number one finger. I mean, it started out as a victory against the Soviet Union in hockey in 1980, and they co-opted that victory, and everything now is, has to have a USA chant and a number one foam finger, which I would think as a person outside the border, you say that's revolting to actually, that in itself typifies the obnoxiousness of our country to think that we're number one. Number one what? But it seems like Murdoch's guilty because he has, bought into this and he's created a monster, which I don't think he has in Australia, if I'm correct.
So the poison that does exist in this country comes through the Murdoch press, News Corp it's called over here, and there's and we've got Fox News over here as well. And if you want to see, so it's one thing that Australia's got as well is it's got the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a state-run news channel. Which is widely viewed by most of the senior people in the country. Pretty much every septuagenarian in the country who's got a thinking brain sits down and watches the ABC. And the foil to that is Murdoch's press, which is all of the the shock jocks and really nasty right-wing commentators and the racist people and the, you know, and you know the extreme right, completely dissing social movements, completely dissing any concern for the environment, completely dissing any idea of social, advancement of minorities, and that's pretty strong. And so and the Liberal Party feeds off out of that trough.
Mm-hmm.
But Australia's got some really good, apart from that. Australia's got very good news and current affairs broadcasting. We've got some really good journalists and some really good shows. And so Australians are really well tapped into the conversation. And then a proportion of them, of course, just watch Fox News and just go along with all of that.
And I take that's a smaller proportion than what we have in the United States, or am I incorrect? 35%, 40% watch Fox.
Are, but I'd say so. Yeah, I'd say so. We've got a politician over here called Pauline Hanson, who used to run a fish and chip shop, and then she got into federal government, and she's obviously female, and she lives up in Western, which is an industrial town up in North Queensland, which has basically been destroyed for gas industry. And she is just this vile racist. And she was actually invited onto, I think it might have been Fox News or anyway, one of the sort of more right-wing sort of news channels. And she was so vile in what she was talking about that she even got kicked off that.
Wow.
There was a lockdown of an apartment block in Melbourne, and she was saying, yes, that's because they're all immigrants and they don't speak English and they don't care, and it was just the way she talks. It's just disgusting. But she's sort of recognised as being disgusting, and so she's sort of like
Ann Coulter.
Yeah, it's not. She's not. Her disgustingness isn't mainstream. It's recognised as extreme, which I think is a good thing.
Right.
Anyway, that's Pauline Hanson. Yeah. Yeah. So I think as a nation, we're much better informed than Americans. I think that, I watch some American news shows, and I think the most of the mainstream stuff the stuff that's more commonly watched has got practically no information value whatsoever. Whereas over here we've got a lot of really good stuff.
Well, I think, as a journalist and as someone who's studied it for years and actually, until it closed, worked for 3 years at the museum. I'd invite you there, but it closed right before, at the end of the year. Unfortunately, I'm not going to do that tonight. We actually in America have always had very biased news, except probably from 1945 to 1980. And it was more economics that balanced it out. But the idea was that my generation and the generation before that, known as the greatest generation, and to a certain extent, the generation after us, you kind of grew up thinking there was and you had objective people. You had Walter Cronkite. The other thing that's happened, and I don't want to belabor this, but I would still say if you're going to rate the accuracy, of news, I would rate it this way. News magazines are the most accurate simply because they have a week to reflect. They have some time to reflect, Newspapers would be the second because contrary to belief, I spent all my life in print, there are checks and balances there that make it a little bit fairer. It's changing because it's also becoming. And then pick your poison from the internet, radio, and television. But again, I would say radio, because of NPR, National Public, we have some very good, what I would call neutral stations. Television is simply about ratings. The chairperson of CBS, he doesn't regret it, saying it because it's true. He shouldn't regret it. And he had a famous comment when Trump was running. He said, well, Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's really good for CBS's ratings. And I think that's something that snuck up on. And I've had numerous conversations with journalists that are still in the business. And, look, if I had been a reporter, Trump makes news. He not in a good way. Every possible way you can. he does, and he gets this coverage. But what I find so interesting about his people, and this is why I say it's a cult, and I believe that to be true. Trump and Fox News, right, appear to be linked at the hip. But they mention 2 or 3 bad things about them, and he throws them to the curb. I mean, the man doesn't even have a concept of loyalty. So, but what I find interesting is his followers do that. Now, they were watching Fox News long before they were enamored with Donald Trump. Okay. Now, Rupert Murdoch, I don't know what his philosophy is, but he's damn good. Again, it's sort of like in America, and I don't know if you have this guy so much in Australia, everybody bemoans the negative ads around election time. But they have a lasting impact, right? And it was the same thing here. If you look at the talk shows across America, and this goes back when they first started, 20 years ago, say, or even a little bit before that, right-wing shows do a lot better than left-wing shows. And so it's about the money. And I think Murdoch looked at that. He saw the opening. British papers, Australian papers, Canadian papers have always had a much more liberal attitude about sex. Unfortunately, we're founded by a bunch of Puritans who went to church on Sunday and then did everything raunchy on Saturday night. So really hypocrites. But this idea, and you have the page 7 centerfolds, and well, he couldn't do that here. So he went, the next best in Fox News is get 42 very attractive blondes.
That's what he did. He did.
Kind of interchangeable. And older folks sitting there fixated on those young blondes, wishing they were 35 or 40 years younger. And it is true. And as a journalist, it does bother me. There's still great journalism out there. But it too has fallen victim to make the money. Even this show, I sometimes feel hypocritical doing it. I'm not an expert, okay? I'm really not. I just know a little bit about a few things, and I know this. I want to do my part to stop Donald Trump, and this is one way I can do it. And we kind of agree around here, like Paul is, when he's on, he's the deep thinker, and Brian also, and I'm kind of the court jester, the clown prince, and I kind of like that role because I think Trump, if he weren't living, he would be a character in satire. One of our best satirists, Brian, is we know his father, Christopher Buckley, right? And his father, William, Buckley was brilliant. I disagree.
Paul was a big fan of
everything the man said. Everything the man said, but he was brilliant. He's like, he was even better. George Will is very good. Buckley was probably better. And Chris just has a book out on Trump, and it even goes past his ability to be a satirist. He just ends up writing some of the things that they did. So you have this newsworthy character getting all this free airtime, and here's what I would ask people to do. You're seeing more and more. I think some people, not all, are saying, who voted for him. And we're seeing a few. And he really doesn't have much margin of loss. When you start hearing, and again, we don't want to be overconfident. You work as, the idea of a politician, I've never been one. I've covered a lot of them. They said you always believe that you're 17 or 25 votes behind, everywhere. You just work to keep getting them, right? Well, but when you start hearing the following states in play, Texas, Florida, wow. Now, I think Alabama's a pipe dream, but I've seen that name in there. And so this brings me up to something I would ask you. We've always had divisions in our country. And of course, one of the biggest, North and South, what literally was geographical in the Civil War. That's not true now. It's more a feeling. We don't have slavery, although I don't know why people want to keep up monuments to generals who were treasonous and were slaves. If anybody could do that, my family's from the South, and we fought on the rebel side. And so, I guess I could claim that, tear the damn things down. But we also have an intellectual versus, kind of anti-intellectual thing, a Midwest. But Australia, from my way of thinking, it has divisions. It doesn't have, it's more a political or philosophical thing than a geographic thing. Is that true?
If there were anything like a division in Australia, I'd say it was city slash country.
Okay, so that's okay.
Australia is, 25 million people. Of the 25 million people, I think around probably 18 of them live in cities. And so in my journeys in Motel Prius over the last few weeks, I've been living in the city of Brisbane for the last 5 years, doing a master's degree over here. And but in the last few months, I've just been traveling around in regional Australia, and it is empty. It is empty. The cattle own some of the most beautiful real estate in Australia. Like one cow has 1,000 hectares of beautiful rolling hills to walk around in, and all of the humans are all densely crammed into the cities. So there's no friction between the city slash country, but the decisions are made in cities by city dwellers. And so sometimes I think the rural people, you often hear this in election time, that the rural people are saying that they're overlooked. So all of the infrastructure spending goes into the city, not so much in the country. And there's a lot of there were race riots in Australia a few years ago. I don't remember exactly really what the cause was, but again in the cities, because we've had so much immigration, you've got like a lot of Lebanese communities, there's Indian communities, there's now Afghans communities, and there's African communities, and so sometimes it all just works just fine. If you go into a shopping centre in one of Australian cities, it's like being in Singapore almost. And there's a lot of Asians. It's a mixing pot. It really is. And a few times there'd been some tensions come up. And quite often it's just that little small proportion of redneck, right-wing, racist, white young men causing trouble with a community somewhere, and it flares up. But it's something that pops up periodically. It's not there all the time. It's a harmonious nation, I think.
You described just real quickly.
To America.
You described a demographic: angry young white men, and we have angry old white men. You suppose? Listen, I don't know how many there are, and I know you don't want to give up the beauty of Australia. But what if we sent all our angry young white men to Australia? You keep yours there. They can go to the outback. You come over with us. And it's funny. We were talking earlier. I mean, America is an empire. I mean, I'd love to say, I don't know why we don't admit that we are. We were. And all empires fall, all countries fall. We can come back, et cetera, et cetera. But I think Americans, it's like they just believe that will never happen. And history teaches us otherwise, right? I'm wondering, too, and this is, I don't have this as a theory yet. I've been playing with it. And we're not going to talk about divinity, divine plan, or any of that, because there's none of that. But sometimes opportunities come out of very bad things, wars, this kind of thing. And I'm wondering, because both you and Brian are far more well-versed in the environment than I have, but I'm kind of wondering if indirectly or directly, of course, unless you assume it was man-made in a lab or somehow connected to 5G, this was a natural virus. I think, whatever. And I'm wondering, I'm kind of hoping, and I'd be interested in both your thoughts on this, that maybe the thing will be, wow, if this can come out of there, and, there's some linkage to environmental causes to that, as we move animals, out of their habitat, into there, that kind of thing, that maybe, just maybe, there'll be more of a movement for environmental type structure. The other thing would be, as we move away, bringing some things home, if you will. We can't make everything in America, but I think, maybe we can do a lot with solar. The sun is everywhere. And all these things. So I'm kind of hoping, I was just wondering your thoughts. Could the pandemic not be for everyone, but for some people, maybe a wake-up call, if you will, just like the fires were kind of a wake-up call for Australia?
Guy,
I think absolutely, yeah. I think what the pandemic has done is a wake-up call is exactly the right expression, and I think it's just made. There's a very clear linkage between environmental destruction and the coronaviruses, particularly in those wet markets
Right.
in Asia, where if a pangolin's got the cold and it can pass it on to a civet cat, well, pangolins and civet cats don't normally pal around together unless you
Right.
throw them into a wet market. So I think it's been a good. I think it's helped people get their head around the fact that that we live in this complex biological system on this planet. So I think it's been positive like that. Um, whether that translates into effective action for the better, that's
Right.
another question. So, for example, one thing that's really interesting about the coronavirus is the carbon emission reductions associated with the slowdown of economies. For a period, anyway, in the first part of this year when it first started, was following exactly the trajectory that the scientists have been saying that we need to go on if we want to have any chance of solving the climate crisis.
Right.
Right. So like a 5% reduction in emissions over a period of like 12 months or whatever, annualized. But of course, as soon as the pandemic's gone, they're going to ramp up the economy as quick as they can to make up for all the lost time and all the lost money, and it's going to go back. So the thing's going to go back up the other way.
I certainly would have a hard time arguing with you on that, but I do think there's a factor out there that may be very interesting. One of the reasons, of course, people aren't traveling so much is people are working from home. And I think there's where I live, and you're certainly welcome to come at any time, and I promise we'll keep you from getting the virus, is Crystal City. It's actually it's a interesting place. As I mentioned, we have 22,000 people live there. It's 3 metro stops from Washington, D.C. But every day, 60,000 people, Monday through Friday, came in there to work. Now, many took public transportation. But after 9/11, Americans, again, in cities wanted to drive. Now, why? I understand that they thought they could get home. But you're not going to get home on public. You actually have a better shot probably of getting home on public transportation than you do. The bridges would be jammed, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now 60,000 people aren't coming in there. And I'm going to hazard a bet that even when the economy ramps up, I'm going to say 30,000 of them may be working from home. So if that's true of every American city or every, again, hopefully it will be a reduction. Amazon, actually, Jeff, if you're listening tonight, that would be Mr. Bezos. Jeff and I are going to become really good friends because his new headquarters is 3 buildings. His first building is 3 buildings from where I live. And again, Jeff, it's wonderful. You make $191,500 a minute. You don't make that, right, Guy? $191,500 a minute. Do you make that? I know I do.
Not from book sales, no.
No, I was just, no. But the thing is, I'm not saying he's a great guy. We go into all the bad things about him. But one of the things they're really pushing this time is they're actually reducing the parking lots that they will have in their new buildings, and they're really encouraging public transportation. So I think it may balance out. I'm not disagreeing with you that they'll want to ramp it up. But ramping up may be a very different ramp up in terms of the travel, at least, I hope. And the other thing that may happen, I've been talking as I write, I've been talking to a lot of business people who are saying, you know what, this is pretty good. We don't have to send 80 regional managers out. We can Zoom it, right? And just think how much 80 people in the company now, a lot of them are going to say, wait a minute, that's when I got away and I could party, and do all this stuff. But for business, so it may be. I mean, that may be another.
Well, Guy, you mentioned that in a roundabout way in Motel Prius because you yourself actually had reservations about your own trip, thinking about the Prius itself. Although it was an economical vehicle, it had a lot of plastic in it, and then you thought about the tire wear and where all that plastic would be going, and I guess it was utilitarian, where you thought in the end. And rightly so. You've done just like this channel. We know that Joe Biden's not great, but I mean, he's like the tire. We're weighing out the Prius versus the Bentley, and we're saying, okay, this is right. But in the end, do we have to kind of measure it that way? The way things will go in the future? I mean, because there will be a cost, even if we're using Zoom or we're working at home. There will be costs. But it's a better route, isn't it?
Okay. So I think that after the pandemic goes away, there will be certain changes that have happened that will stay in place, and one of which I think will be a lot more of this zooming instead of driving. Okay, but so you'll probably be able to actually do the sums and see what the overall carbon benefit, if you're measuring it in carbon, of that would be. But the underlying problem is that we live in our global capitalist system. It's based on a growth economy. So all that will really happen is that whatever benefit you get from not driving and zooming instead will be erased over the period of a number of years as the economy grows at 2 or 3% per annum. And so that bit hasn't been fixed. So whilst you have more people doing tele stuff rather than driving, that will be quickly erased by growth. Look, fundamentally, if I can just come back to a couple of points. So you mentioned Bezos and Amazon, and what the billionaires do these days. They've always had a problem, is that when you've got so much money, you've got to figure out how to spend it, and so you go and spend it on the most expensive nonsense you can find, which once upon a time might have been, I don't know what it was, but these days it's space travel.
Right.
And Bezos, of course, has got Blue Origin, and he's trying to put people into low orbit for space tourism purposes. In Australia, we've got a billionaire called Mike Cannon-Brookes. There's actually two of them. They're two CEOs, the co-CEOs of a company called Atlassian. So Mike Cannon-Brookes is sort of most renowned because he's quite commonly, he's a public commentator on things. And the other fellow's name slips my mind. But there's two of them. Anyway, they're worth something in the order of $10 billion each. And these guys are hipsters. So they're in their kind of like early 30s or something. And they set up this software company. It went gangbusters. And Mike Cannon-Brookes is a fierce proponent for a rapid transition to clean energy in Australia, and has put money, $10 million into a project called Sun Cable, where they're looking at putting in a massive, it's like I think about 4 gigawatt solar farm in northwestern Australia, with a view to running electricity by an undersea cable to Singapore.
Wow.
Selling electricity to Singapore, solar-powered electricity to Singapore from Australia. And I saw him, I did an Al Gore training event last sometime, and Mike Cannon-Brookes came on stage, and Mike Cannon-Brookes says, what we need to do in Australia, we need to have 200% solar power, 100% to run Australia, and 100% extra to sell. And he's a visionary. He's just announced the new headquarters of their company is going to be in this tower built over the next few years in Sydney, which has got a wood frame. It's a wood frame 40-story tower. So this guy is a visionary who's actually putting his money into the transition. And so this is something, and again, this is a commentary about America, is I just don't see your billionaires doing that. I can't name one of the billionaires in America that has actually got his head around the concept of a sustainability transition. So you've got Bezos, one of the richest guys in the world, is pissing his money away with space tourism, and then you got Elon Musk, who wants to go to fucking Mars. So where is the billionaire class who's actually got its head around the problem and is actively trying to fix it?
You mentioned, which I think is again hope. I mean, I still always will have hope until my last breath. You said relatively new. You're hipsters. I think there are young people who are on their way to their billions now, and I know that yes, in essence, human nature and people don't change, but things change, and I think they don't see much hope unless things change. Guns in America have to change for them to have hope. There's certainly, and it has to do with denial and aging, and certainly a lot of young people believe that if we don't do something, they have at best 10, 20 years on the planet. So again, I agree, but also I've never been anywhere close. I once had $14 in my wallet. That's about as close to a billionaire as I've ever gotten. But the idea of it is that they are a club, right? And if they see some, like the gentleman you're mentioning in Australia doing it, and they see that he gets some acclaim and fame, they may want to do more. Do you know what I mean? That's why I like the people, your gentleman in Australia, it's a risk taker. I don't want to dominate, but I do want to ask this question. I ask it of every Australian. In the event that Donald Trump wins, how many Americans can you house in your house? Because personally, not just temporarily until they can find it. Because I know a number want to go to Canada. I would have gone there during Vietnam, probably if I'd gotten drafted. I would hope I would have courage enough to go to jail at that point. I don't think I would have today. But I'm looking more to Australia, New Zealand.
But Australia is no picnic. I mean, as far as the environment, I mean, you're ground zero, aren't you, Guy?
But Brian,
ground zero in terms of, where is climate change affecting the geographical terror frame the most? It seems like it's Australia. It was burning last year. I mean, am I wrong?
Yes and no. I think it's affecting everywhere. I mean, where it's most affecting as we speak is the Arctic. They've had right. It's been like 30 degrees Celsius in the Arctic, and it's not supposed to be 30 Celsius degree. It's 20 degrees above average over there over this heat wave period. But it's and I hear that there's a big heat dome coming over over America. It's everywhere. It's right. Everywhere that we've and this is we had the wildfires that kind of started around November and finished around about February or something. And then we're moving into, so 6 months from now, it'll be a year. And during that time, the humans have added an extra 30 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. And then a year from now, we'll have added another 30 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. And so, the global warming problem is caused by the accumulation of the carbon gas in the atmosphere. It's the accumulated volume of CO2 gas predominantly. Right. That is the problem, not the amount that you put in annually. So if you were to hypothetically stop burning carbon over the next couple of years, right. It wouldn't change
for
the
30
physics.
Years or something.
Well, that's right. This is the lag, right? And so there was a science paper came out the other day that I was reading, and it said that if we were to stop burning fossil fuels overnight, it would be 20 or 30 years before you'd actually see temperature changes in the positive. Mm-hmm. And so how the fuck are you going to convince populations to go about transformations of their economy? Because people will be saying, well, there's not going to be any evidence of it during my lifetime, most of my lifetime.
Right.
Okay, so, I mean, this is the dire straits we're in. And the fundamental thing, and I refer to this in the book, Motel Prius, and I think I refer to it in pretty much it's a staple for me, is a paper that came out 2 years ago called Transitions of the Earth System in the Anthropocene by Will Stephan and others. And basically what they're saying is that the planet, if you look at the planet's climate over billions of years, that it has two phases. It has a cool phase and it has a hot phase. And we have grown up and when you go into the hot phase, basically it bleaches most life off the planet, right? So, for example, the Permian extinction 253 million years ago was a hot phase caused by CO2 emissions, predominantly from volcanic eruptions and so forth. And that bleached about 70 or 80% of living things on the planet. Pretty much the only things that survived was a funny-looking fish on the bottom of the ocean. And so what the paper is saying is that somewhere between 1 and 2 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline temperatures is where the flip happens. Okay, and what they call a cascade of climate tipping points. So one thing happens, which leads to another thing happening, which leads to another thing, and in the space of potentially decades, not centuries or millennia, potentially decades, you can actually go into the point where you end up with this runaway greenhouse effect, and that will take out most life on Earth. And the first thing it'll do is it'll kill off food production, and then you'll have the social crises and the collapse of your societies, and then you'll just see the fires that won't stop burning. And so that is the main thing that we should be talking about strategically avoiding, which is a global transition to clean energy and the rehabilitation of nature.
And this is exactly where Dave and I have taken a political stance, because although, as Dave said, we've had an American empire, so to speak, but and maybe that's gone right now. Well, it's definitely gone, but without the United States getting involved in climate change, because you're certainly not going to get it from Russia. I mean, I keep in contact with those people. No. Nothing. And you've got the East Siberian Sea there, all the methane, blah, blah, blah. It's not going to happen there unless they get pressure from the United States. And you know, Guy, as well as I do, that Trump is not going to pressure Putin. So this channel, this idea that we have to vote for Biden, in essence, is just not an American political issue.
No,
it's a
no.
world issue, because if we're going to get on top of this, because as you say, we have basically a carbon bomb facing us, it has to be done. And you can't expect countries like Canada and this is, again, nothing against Australia, but they're not large countries with large populations, and they can't put the pressure on Putin. But we can. And this is why, if we want to achieve, as you say, this era of, a billion years or 200 million years where human beings can still live instead of being like a virus, we've got to win this election. I mean, you lose the election, you might lose the planet.
Yeah. Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that Biden's going to lead America into the sort of transition that is needed. And again, this is why I think the Extinction Rebellion is a really interesting model, because if the Extinction Rebellion can be effective in its objective in the UK, which is where it was founded, which basically means that the rebels gridlock the capital until the government concedes and says, okay, we'll do the rapid transition. Then if Britain goes, you only need one country to go first, right? And then other like-minded countries, enlightened countries, will say, nobody wants to go first, right? Nobody wants to go first. Nobody knows how to go first. Nobody believes that anybody, everyone thinks it's a great idea, but nobody's got the balls to actually go and do it. But if through a mechanism like the Extinction Rebellion, Britain, now I say Britain because I'm British originally, I'm a POM and a British-born Australian. But the thing about Britain is it punches way above its weight. It may have 80 million people, but of course it's a colonial power, nuclear power. It's got weight. If Britain committed to a rapid transition, and this is not just reducing carbon, but sequestering carbon and regrowing as much of nature as possible to stabilize the loss of ecosystems and biodiversity, then that nation would be able to lead the world. It would be the leader. And there would be huge kudos. But of course, what happens in Britain, as in every country, the established power elite, economic elite, have got the control over the government system. And so they are the ones, it's the fossil fuel elites are the ones who have the most risk, because they're going to have to write off a lot of assets. With that said, if they were more enlightened, they'd actually stop seeing themselves as fossil fuel companies and see themselves as energy companies.
Energy companies, exactly.
Do the transition. So I personally don't have a problem with BP being a huge behemoth of a company if it was actually producing renewable energy. But it's not. It continues to go and explore, and it's not. And it hasn't even started winding back. They're still exploring. So they're still investing trillions of dollars into new infrastructure. And every billion or $1 trillion of fossil fuel infrastructure has got 30 or 40 years of time for it to continue putting carbon in the atmosphere.
Right.
So one of the other interesting papers I saw a few years ago, I was reading it, was saying one way to actually plot the future trajectory of carbon into the atmosphere is to look at the sale of or the production of certain machinery. So if you build a gigawatt coal-fired power station, okay, well, that thing's going to be burning a gigawatt for the next 40 years, right? So you can actually do forward projections. And so if you wanted to try and meet these big carbon budgets to try and stop the planet falling over, then it effectively means you've got to stop selling internal combustion engines 3 years ago, right, to accommodate for all of these lags. So we're not seeing any country make any. We're seeing a lot of good things happening, and we're seeing a lot of renewable energy. It's becoming extremely inexpensive. I met a guy on my travels recently. I was in Byron Shire. This guy is into domestic solar power, so he does install solar power systems. He's teed up with a guy that imports second-hand electric cars from Japan. And so what he's now doing is he's putting in these solar-powered systems, so you've got a solar-powered electric car. Okay, so this guy up in the hills at the back of Byron Bay is doing this, but there's no nation in the world that's doing that in the sort of way that nations can do it, which is, hey, change policy, change the funding, let's go for this thing, right? It's got to happen. And every day that we delay, it's just more carbon in the atmosphere, and more risk closer to the climate tipping points. Very frustrating. And
Brian,
it's
I haven't been paying a lot of attention to the questions. I've been listening to Guy, because I find his thoughts fascinating. Do we have any questions out there?
We have a lot of comments. We don't have any
I don't want to deal
questions.
with comments so much. Listen, what I would like, you can't force anyone to do anything, but if you're on this end, comments are great. We encourage them, but questions, when you have people in front of you. So I'll start it off. In the 80s, you had a band, Men at Work. A very good band down there.
Yeah.
And they said something that I couldn't understand. And I guess it was Vegemite sandwich is what it came out. What in God's name is a Vegemite sandwich? And is it any goddamn good?
They're delicious. Yeah, Vegemite is it's a black. It looks like solidified crude oil. It looks like bitumen.
Good. That's fair. Yeah, that makes me want to eat it.
Yeah, I think it's a yeast extract. So it's got a pungent aroma, and you buy it in a jar. It's called Vegemite, and you basically get it out of the jar with a knife, and you spread it on bread, and then you eat it. Delicious.
Now, do you make it a sandwich? Do you make it a sandwich or an open faced sandwich? Okay.
Yeah, no, you just put it on bread.
I never knew what that was.
It's good.
I thought it was something like Dolomite.
It's very, very nutritious and salty and tasty.
Is it available? I mean, obviously, Australians live all over the world, but is that unique to Australia originally? I mean, is it something that was kind of not invented because you don't invent yeast, but
I think the company actually got bought out by a foreign company, which is a travesty, but it's still widely available. And if you were to open an Australian shop, a shop selling Australian stuff, that's the first thing you'd order.
We do have a question from Down Under. Guy, how's your religion going? That's from our Keith Boyd.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so let me update you, because there's some interesting things have happened in that space since we last spoke. So on the 20th of March this year, the Australian government gave us the ticket. So we now have a registered religious institution devoted not to God, but to the living planet, and it's called Vita. So what I've done is I've created a religion devoted to the planet. And what we've done, in order to do that, there's two things you've got to demonstrate to the Charity Commission, is you've got to demonstrate a belief in a supernatural principle, entity, or thing, and the acceptance of canons of conduct that give effect to that belief. So with respect to the first, the supernatural, we took the idea of Gaia, as in James Lovelock's Gaia theory, which says that everything, all the living things on the planet behave in the manner of a living organism, single organism. And we just sort of tweaked that a little bit to say that all the living things on the planet are a single living organism, which we refer to as Vitae Planeta, and there's a reason for that name. And so that basically becomes the supernatural being to which Vita religion is devoted. And so it's a religion devoted to the planet. Just the other day, my co-conspirator in this, whose name is Bill, who lives in Sydney, we wrote a letter to the Bureau of Statistics asking that they put a new section in the census, which is coming out next year, to allow for people who identify a spirituality related to nature to actually have a box to check on the census form. And we had a letter from a professor of religion called Bron Taylor from the University of Florida, who basically explained that in Australia, 30% of the public write none when it has religious affiliation. And so what he's saying is that a significant proportion of the nuns would probably actually identify as a nature-based religion if one were available. Mm-hmm. And so really what we're trying to do is we're trying to create Vita in a way that in a way, what I'm trying to do is the idea of the religion is to try and create a structured pathway to people having a spirituality devoted to nature. That's what it's about. And not with us asking them to do anything, but with the view that if you're spiritually connected to nature, you'll act in her
accordingly.
Defense.
You know what's so interesting about that? I can see. I don't think we have a wide viewership among the evangelical snake handlers and false prophets in America. But, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And if you think about when you mention Gaia and you look at ancient religions, how many really did have as one of their central precepts, if not their major central precept, some kind of respect for nature. And people lived closer then. So, anybody who looks at that as like absolutely batshit crazy is completely wrong.
Well, it actually is something visible too. That you can actually see it, the planet. It's not like God where you don't know. I mean, look, the Catholic Church, Guy and Dave, received $350 million in a stimulus check, and they did not audit them. I don't know if you would think of doing that here, but you could. I don't know if did you get a stimulus check for? No, I guess not.
No, you don't actually get anything special for being a religion. Okay, so there's an idea that people say, oh, you only did it for the tax break. So I tell you the process. So we submitted the paperwork to the Charity Commission, and we had to incorporate a vehicle. So we created a public company limited by guarantee, so a non-profit company. We submitted the paperwork to the Charity Commission, and they accepted us as a charity. And as a result of that, the company is income tax exempt, doesn't pay the goods and service tax, and is exempt from fringe benefits tax. But there's no other additional benefits. So one of the things you want as a charity in Australia is a thing called DGR, which is the deductible gift recipient status, which means that if somebody gives, like say, for example, a company gives you $10,000, then the company can claim the $10,000 as a tax write-off. Right. So if you've got DGR, so one charity I was involved in, we had a guy who said, I'll give you $10,000. If you had DGR, I'll give you $20,000. So it's a very meaningful and tangible thing. In Australia, there's about 50 categories that you can get DGR for, but none of those categories are for a religion. Mm-hmm. So if we wanted to have a DGR fund, we would actually have to incorporate a different vehicle, say, for example, a charitable trust, for example, with the charity subtype advancing education, and that we could potentially have the DGR through that. So to build like a school in order to teach people about the Veda religion. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've got planned down the track. But at the moment, there's no resources in the group.
Because Keith Boyd here is asking you, and he is down under. He wanted to know where you folks were meeting. Do you have a meeting?
Okay, so the idea of Veda is it's a very flat organizational structure, so it's not hierarchical. There's no pope per se. So the idea is that Veda can be founded around chapters. So anybody who wants to found a Veda chapter simply needs to put their hand up. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a Certificate 4 course, a Certificate 4 in the Vedan religion, so that people can do the course, sit the course, pass the exam, and basically become official ministers. Because in Australia, so for example, in Australia, the immigration department has got a visa that allows you to bring people into the country if they are ministers of a religion. And so there's and this is what I'm learning as I'm sort of reading more about, now that we've created this thing, what's it good for? What can we do with it? Where, somebody says, oh, if you're a religion, the government will give you free land. I'm like, oh, really? Well, I haven't actually found if that's true yet. So the established religions know about this stuff because they've been doing it a long time, but Veda is still trying to get its head around what the opportunities are associated with the structure that we've got. But what we want to do, and what we're doing, we're trying to get to some of the wealthy people in Australia to see if we can find a benefactor who will basically help us to spread it rapidly. So at the moment, the people that are involved in it, we're not resourced, and so it's not really spreading very fast. But we think, and then this is something else, when we filled in the paperwork for the Charity Commission, they asked how many Vetans are there, and which is a little bit unfair. It's a bit like asking how many Christians there were before Jesus walked down the beach and talked to the fishermen. There was one, right? So what we said in the response was, whilst there's only a few people that know about it, we think that there are 53 million people in the Western world who would identify as Vetans if they learned about it. And the 53 million is a quarter of the cultural creatives. So the cultural creatives is a psychographic description of people fitting into one of three categories, and this is work by American sociologists in a book called Cultural Creatives. And these sociologists were commissioned by the American EPA to get inside the head of Americans to help develop environmental programs. And what they found was that there were these three ways that people see the world. And they called them conservatives, moderns,
right,
and cultural creatives. So the moderns represent over half of the population. The conservatives sort of hark back to how things were. The moderns like it just the way it is. And the cultural creatives are trying to make a better world. You guys are cultural creatives, right?
Right.
And within the cultural creatives, there are what they call the green and the core. So the green make up more than half of the cultural creatives, and the core are like the thought leaders.
And we
So
wear
you guys are
black
probably
too.
doing the
I
core,
remember
right?
that from your book. We wear black, so that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah. And so what we said is that we think a quarter of the cultural creatives would identify as Beaton once we've got all of our, material put together properly and we're communicating clearly what we're trying to do. So that's 53 million people. So that's the objective: is to get the 53 million people to identify as Beaton and to listen effectively, to what we have to say, not necessarily to follow what we have to say, but to listen to it. And people can actually create nodes of the Beaton religion just by putting their hand up. And the way it spreads is through parties on the full moon. So the idea is that on the full moon, the full moon is said to be full over 3 nights. So on one of those nights, you bring together a group of people for big talk. And big talk is talking about civilization and climate change and collapse and the sort of things that you guys are talking about. That's what we're creating.
Brian, you need one of these things now. Something just broke up here. My favorite Alabama politician, Jeff Sessions, is no more. He lost, very interestingly, in an Alabama primary guy, which is Alabama's a very southern state, very redneck state. Jeff Sessions it's worth an object lesson, was the first major, he was a senator in Alabama, was the first major political figure to come out for Donald Trump, okay, in America. Donald Trump rewarded him, which, is what happens, winners get to reward, to make him the attorney general. And he was very high, I only hired the best people, and of course, as soon as Jeff Sessions recused himself, which was amazingly for Jeff, something that was proper, then Trump disowned him, abused him, and Sessions, who was probably not probably, there was nobody even close. The only person who could have beaten him in Alabama prior to his association with Trump would have been the football coach at the University of Alabama. He polls higher numbers than Jesus Christ.
But wasn't it the one running against him backed by Trump?
The guy that was running against him was interesting. He's a former coach from Auburn, and that's a college also in Alabama. And in the whole state, you either identify, it's sort of like Republican or Democrat. You're either a University of Alabama fan or an Auburn fan. And this guy actually won a national championship at Auburn. So it's just very interesting. Before we write off Donald Trump anywhere, Trump dropped Sessions, which I think was horrific, good for him, just showing his lack of loyalty. But now Sessions, who was extremely popular, which is what worries me about this cult, the Trump cult is now persona non grata, based on the fact that Trump has dissed him. Of course, it's not a pure experiment, because you did have this well-known football coach, running. And in the South, they say preachers know. Football coaches do far better than preachers in the South. But I just think it's interesting. A point tonight that I would like to make, and again, we're speaking to the wrong crowd, is certainly, if anyone should have been rewarded for making Donald Trump the president, I think it would be the first political figure, right, who backed him. And Trump just threw him to the curb, as he will everyone and anyone. And I don't understand, and I've asked, I don't want to say thousands, but hundreds of Trump supporters, doesn't it bother you that the man shows no loyalty to anyone? How is he going to be loyal to you? And I'll be honest, if the Democrats had approached him, he would have run as a Democrat. There's no question. The man has no basis of any. He's the best in quotes, meaning worst, con man in American history since P.T. Barnum. And it just boggles my mind that they continue, and it doesn't matter tonight because of your expertise. We spent a lot of time talking about Australia, which is good because I think we always need those comparisons. We spent a lot of time talking about the environment, which is would obviously be would have to be the number one worldwide issue in terms of the imminent destruction. Right. I mean that has to be it. But here in America, we're still worried about. We put a football coach in for Alabama, but people can't see that no matter what issue we talk about in America, if you are a Trump supporter, you can't. They can't even say, Guy, and you're not here. They can't even say, well, he's bad here but good here. The only thing that they do say, I don't like the language he uses sometimes, but I do. And the other one that put him in, he's a good businessman. Now, I've heard that since I became active in I guess street politics when I was 18 in 1968, and been off and on when my job would allow ever since. And I've been hearing that ever since I remember. Oh, government should be run by a business. And unfortunately, it's not a business. They're two different things. Business is about profit and government is about benefiting people, and they don't always come together. And but even if you were to believe that with Trump, I mean, his everything that man touches, business-wise, has failed. I mean, where I'm at tonight, 35 minutes from Atlantic City, the casinos, 3 failed casinos there, a failed university, a failed this, a failed that, a failed state, everything the man has. And what's going to happen, and his people aren't going to see it, is he'll walk away with a failed country. But the nice thing is a failed country is not like a failed business. It'll still be here. And, we were talking earlier about Biden, and like I said, I'm not as down on Biden as many people are for a very practical reason. I agree, Guy, with what you said. Biden is not going to give you that change. But for me, if I'll use a road analogy. Okay, so Trump is, way back in the road, and I want to get to let's say the shining city on a hill. We'll use Reagan's thing. But Trump is actually pulling me further away, right? Biden is not going to get me there, but he's going to get me closer. And I would prefer the closer walk to what should.
Yeah.
And the second thing, I think, and again, I am addressing people tonight who are hesitant to do that. A lot of people believed in Bernie Sanders as a deliverer of what they consider to be a good government. And I think I was a Sanders supporter in 2016. In 2020. I chose the closest thing to Bernie who could possibly win, Elizabeth Warren. She did not. I'll back Biden. I mean, I'm not my candidate. But I think what I would like to say to them, if Bernie was your candidate, or Elizabeth Warren was your candidate, or even the financier, Mr. Wang, or any of the candidates, they're going to have Biden's ear. They're going to have Biden's ear. It's going to be very hard for Joe Biden. 2 reasons. It'll be very hard for Joe Biden to be Joe Biden, which is not necessarily a bad thing. One is because he does have the Democratic Party is more split than normal in terms of very liberal and centrist liberal, and Biden's a representative of that. But a growing number are there, and you have to address it. And the second thing is these people who are the spokesperson. Just a little aside, I loved Occupy, the Occupy movement, but the problem is it was unrealistic. You have to have leaders. I mean, the problem is you have to have leaders who won't turn on you or fall to greed or that. You need spokespeople. I mean, it's just the way that it works. I don't see collectively doing. I mean, collectives are great, but those people are Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. If you liked any of the other guys, they're going to have the ear of Joe Biden. In fact, a number of them, I'm going to make a prediction. I could be wrong. Between the vice presidency and the 14 cabinet positions, at least 5 people who ran against Biden in the primary will assume those positions. So my point is, if they are your person, you can't vote for them. You could write them in. They're not going to win. But I think you're going to get surprisingly more. The second reason is Biden can't be Biden. If you want to say a centrist position is not going to be able to handle the pandemic. It's just not in the long run, especially not with the damage done in America. It's just not. I think you're going to need, and you're seeing those words thrown around, you're going to need something like, it's cliched, but you're going to need FDR on steroids, really, to get back. We haven't even begun to see the economic devastation here. Trump wills that away. We haven't. We're still, I was talking today to someone, and, we're still in the first phase. Australia is ready for the second phase, okay? New Zealand. And we're still in the first phase.
We're not out of it.
And we're just not anywhere clear. And we're talking about opening schools, and we're talking about this, and we're talking about the other. So when you put the fact that we are, man, I can't even put the number of days. It's almost the equivalent of years behind in terms of handling the pandemic. Nobody can even imagine the effects. People in Washington were saying, people that I believe are true, pictures. They said if we get a second round of closings, which we may have to get the pandemic underway or get the pandemic under control here, we'll lose 80% of small businesses. Well, as horrific as that is, if you don't get the pandemic under control, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think people, you talked very eloquently earlier. It's just true. I mean, conservatives look to the past. They want to keep what's there, conserve, preserve. They all come from that kind of route. You can't do that in change, but especially not now. I think it's overstated, but I do believe it sounds science fiction-y, but it's true. A number of people are saying this about 2019, the X number of years up, as the before time. And I think a lot of things, like I say, this world, we're not going to see, I don't think I will live long enough. And I'm not sure my son, who's 47, will live long enough. Maybe my grandchildren will. But by that point, normal will not be normal, if just over a period of time, to ever see that world again. And so new things will happen. If these small businesses go under, look at them. I mean, and again, I'd love to see a different system than capitalism, but it's what we're going to work under in America for a fairly long time until we figure out something else. The other thing related to that is I want to ask about Australia. Here in America, there seems to be a fear specifically of communism and socialism, and not a fear of fascism and authoritarianism. And it's almost like I'm opting for I'd rather have 1984, or a not brave new, that kinds of things. And I just wonder, is there a couple buzzwords in Australia? Oh my God, we can't have that. I mean, obviously not socialism, but or are we unique in that respect here?
I think you're unique in that respect. There, I think socialism is a pretty well established concept in Australia.
Right.
Australians don't associate socialism with communism, for example.
Right.
Okay, and I can understand if you were a part of the ruling elite and you're putting out the messaging to the public, you'd want them to fear the thing that actually makes society fairer, right? Because it's in their interest to maintain the system that you've got. We just don't have the same level of hysteria. There's a hysteria in America associated with those words and phrases. In Australia, I mean, there are some really narky right-wing politicians that you just don't want to get into positions of power. But they're smaller number, and generally speaking, they don't have strong support bases. And of course, socialism, the way that people like Bernie Sanders talk about socialism isn't communism. It's the socialism that you see in the Nordic countries, where they've got high taxation and good healthcare systems and good education systems, which then creates a different electorate that is more likely to elect sensible people. But you're sort of in America, what you've got is this sort of spiral, and particularly with someone like Betsy DeVos, born-again Christian billionaire running the education department, is that if your public isn't smart enough, it's going to make bad decisions about governance, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy or a positive feedback loop. You
might not be an expert in this, but you just prompted a question that troubles me in America. when my generation grew up, there was a course that we all took called civics. It was basically offered in ninth grade. And civics was just, it was a study of government, and you kind of, and of course it was interesting that it was taught from a very American standpoint, meaning, it was all good and everything. Yet that group of people, we were the ones that were the first to rebel, because what we looked at is, wait a minute, the America we learned about in ninth grade is not out there. Where is it? And civics was taken away. It's taught very rarely now. And what happened was, I can understand you can't teach everything. And they were looking at the world. They said, well, we need more about world government, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But the idea of it is, when civics went, I think, there are it wasn't a guarantee, but it would be pretty hard to escape from junior high school or middle school or whatever you think in America without knowing something about your government. Your state government, of course, varies, but that was done in the elementary grades, and that's still done to a certain extent. Does Australia have a course similar to that anywhere, or is it embedded throughout their education system? Civics meaning kind of the study of government, what we call more advanced political science, maybe at a college level. But that, of course, that's more theory and that kind of thing. But really, how the government works, how it's supposed to work, at least laid out, or do they not have such a course?
I did my my high school in the United Kingdom, and
Right.
I did 1 year of high school when I got to Australia. So I don't really know actually whether that's taught. I think it would be. I think there would be a class called civics or something. In fact, I think I remember sitting one, and I remember thinking. I think I remember sitting in the year that I did in Australian school, and just not knowing why we were talking about how the government worked. I didn't understand.
Right.
But I guess part of the the way that you frame that class is to say, you have freedoms in this country, and they're expressed through these mechanisms, and that's why we're teaching you about it. I did when I did my environmental science degree. One of my majors was environmental policy, so I did a lot of
Right. So we come up there exactly
through there, yeah. And so what we're looking at is how policy around the environment is framed in Australia, and that's where I learned that stuff.
And I think one of the
government's function.
Of course, I have a different view of that. That at the point that we received it in the 50s and 60s, it was indoctrination. But I still want it to be taught, because the moment you say all men are created equal, right? And that's one of our founding things. And then you can argue about men and all. But I'm just saying, basically, let's use the interpretation now that, people are created equal. And you look around and you see, wait a minute, that's not working. And I like that, because, my argument against America is we have wonderful. The founding fathers, you can fault them all you want for being slave owners, and certainly the compromises they made were horrific, et cetera, et cetera. But they did provide this wonderful framework that we've never truly used. But I think it is good. It's like the hypocrisy factor. It's very hard to look at the founding documents and say, oh, yeah, we did that, or we did this, or we did the other. Even the First Amendment, we're not going to talk about that tonight a lot, but that's very crucial to America. Such a misunderstanding of what it is. The Second Amendment is a real sore spot of mine, so I do announce this a lot. If you believe that guns cannot be regulated, not you, Guy, but anyone who believes that, here is the wording. It begins this way: a well-regulated militia. So regulate, the third word in the Second Amendment. So all we should be arguing over is not can they be regulated, but what regulations make sense in the 21st century. And that's embedded in our history. Actually, people don't understand, if you look at history, you had guns, right? I mean, in the revolutionary times, but you didn't have a lot of ammo. That was stored in the center. In Tombstone, the center of the American myth, the first thing you did when you arrived at Tombstone, unless you were Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday, you defied the law and became American outlaw heroes, was you checked your guns. So I think, again, maybe, and I don't know this, I was hoping to be there in Australia and look at your education system, and I'll still get there someday to do it, because I just have a feeling. I am very familiar with Sweden. We had a sister city there, and I had one of my best friends in the world is a longtime teacher there, and we were at her house and stayed there. She'd come over here, and And they have some very good courses throughout the time where they look at the government. You know what I mean? And I think that is a failing of America. So I would assume Australia does. I don't know that. Any other questions?
Yes, there
there,
are
Brian?
two. They're good questions, but they're just two entirely different questions. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask them. Guy Rudel Zalvedno has asked you if you see any way to extract 150 parts per million CO2 out of the atmosphere. Latest climate models prepared by PIK and IPCC predict 2.9 to 7.7 C warming by the end of this century if CO2 levels are above 400 parts per million. So do you see any way to extract 150 out?
Well, yeah. So there's a group in America called climate restoration, and the model that they're focusing on is to get back to 350 ppm. Get to 300 parts per million by mid-century. And so they've been investigating a whole bunch of different techniques. And one of the things that they've identified is a chemical process where they can actually basically create sort of like the way that shellfish create calcium carbonate shells. So they've got this process whereby they can create this calcium carbonate type material. And the idea is to then use it as road base, because road base is one of the only materials which is used on the gigaton scale. And so what they're trying to do is basically find a way to make a dollar out of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So that's one pathway. So if you just Google climate restoration, there's a guy called Peter Fikowski is the head of it. He's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. Also, I've got one of my half-written novels, which I picked back up again the other day. I'm going to complete in the next few weeks. It's called The Plume, and it talks about upwelling pumps. So upwelling pump is an idea of bringing water from 300 or 400 meters below the surface of the ocean to the surface, and the water at depth has got nutrient in it, and the water on the surface over much of the ocean has no nutrient. And so when you bring the nutrient-rich water up, you create a phytoplankton bloom, and that is a carbon pump that helps pull carbon out of the atmosphere and sink it down into the ocean. And there's some figures around that if you can do enough of that you can potentially harvest huge amounts of carbon and at the same time rehabilitate ocean ecosystems. And then, of course, you got soil carbon sequestration. So if you put all of these things into play and created an economic structure that rewarded carbon capture, I'm pretty sure we could do anything that we need to do, but we're just wasting time. We haven't started yet. I don't know. I don't even know what that means.
Okay, Brian, I want to use regular occurring guest. Yeah, that would be Gary. I think because of Guy's status and the fact that he's on the show, I'm gonna bow out in a couple minutes, and you can close with just the two of you. I'm not even gonna do closing remarks tonight because it's not that important. But Guy, I do have a question. I think especially I work a lot with young people. And Brian and I kind of joke, but there's some truth to this. Brian, if there were two rooms, one says optimist, go in, the other says pessimist, Brian would probably go in the pessimist room, and I would probably go in the optimist room. And it's just based on faith, hope, the things that we don't have. We had a young man on the other, last week, last week, Antonio, who basically has told me he doesn't see himself. It really doesn't matter. He's a black man who says, whether it's racism or climate dissolution, I probably won't live to see 2030. If you had to pick one of those rooms, you're very knowledgeable in a lot of areas. Do you find reason for more optimism or more pessimism, realizing that everything in life is a balance? So we're not saying you're 100%, but you have to walk in one of those rooms knowing what you see now and what could happen. Are you more optimistic about the future of humankind or more pessimistic?
If I had to choose one or the other, I'd have to be it depends on what day you ask me the question. But
I
right
understand,
now,
and what topic we're talking. We're talking about the whole of
yeah,
humanity,
yeah,
everything, all the
yeah,
divisions
yeah,
that we talk about.
yeah, yeah. I think I'd be slightly more in the optimistic, but sort of sitting on the very edge, right next to the door. You know what I'm saying?
Always a good place to
Yeah,
be.
and look, I think species last on average about 500,000 years. If you actually look at how long they last, right? So
Right.
if we take down nature and we take down the human race and the humans go extinct, the planet will bounce back
Correct.
in 30 or 40 or 50 million years time, right? So if you can get your head around the concept that we may simply have already triggered that. This is one of the things I talk about in Motel Prius, and I call it Vetan philosophy, 2 pillars of Vetan philosophy, is that if you can be comfortable with the fact that we may have already triggered the cascade of climate tipping points and leads to the extinction of our own race, if you can just be comfortable with that, then it sort of frees you up to act in a manner to try and bring about the alternative. Now, the alternative isn't that everything's going to be fine tomorrow, right? We're going into hell. We've got a 30-year lag. If we turn off the fossil fuels, that's going to be hellish in the first place because of the economic disruptions. And then we've still got worsening conditions for the next 30 years. So, the optimism part of it says, in my mind, I think that we can get through this. And when I say we can get through this, I think we're probably going to lose half of the world's population. We're probably going to lose most of the world's rainforest. We're probably going to lose all of the coral reefs. But it might be that through that process, that bleaching event, that a more sensible human race comes through the other side, and then we can start regrowing nature from what's left.
If what you say, if we do lose half the human race, I know my vote is I would like to stay and throw Brian off the island. That's what I would like to do. Okay. And Guy, you're welcome to stay. It's been enjoyable. It's fascinating. I'm sitting here, and normally I'm pretty focused, on what I want to say. I don't really think about it; it just flows out. But I don't want to form some mutual kumbaya. But I really, this is the first time we met 15 minutes before the show or something like that, and I think I think we need more people like yourself, because I think what I took away from this is when you speak, there's some backing to it, but not that academic kind of thing. I think tempered with some reality. Like you said, I read this study, but you didn't quote it verbatim. You put it into something that people could understand. But I think if you're going to be a church person, shouldn't you get a Cadillac that burns a lot of fuel and a private jet? All the evangelical preachers. And secondly, I don't want to get into your private life, but you're going to need a few hookers, because most of the preachers are found later to be with hookers. And the last thing, as I say, is
only Dave would know.
Well, I've covered a lot of that. So
apparently,
figure out whatever that means. But the other thing I was going to say, roughly, if I understand Australia, is my last comment. You have this kind of outback area that's kind of desolate. You don't have a lot of people. How many Americans, if we put together a group, like I say, if Donald Trump wins, could you accept? Let's see. Could you accept 70 million Americans? There, could you take us in?
Well, if they become Vetans and they sit the certificate 4 in Vetan religion and become ministers, then they can come in on the 242 visa.
Well, I'm really considering that, because right now I can't get in. And Keith, you said earlier, did I get your direct message? Yes, I did, and thank you for that offer. You just have to be careful, because someday in the town of Brisbane, Dave Price will show up knocking on Keith Boyd's door. Guys,
I wouldn't doubt it.
I think there's a gentleman's club open. No, that's not
Dave,
it.
before you take off those headphones, I do want to say yes. I would be the more negative of the three of us. I would understand that. Okay, I'm a pessimist. However, I think the one thing we all share is that I would go down fighting. You owe it to yourself. You're obligated to do something, which is why I'm voting for somebody that I don't really like. But I do know, as you said in your analogy, like that road leading to, that hill in the sky or whatever. You've got to make choices, and I can't sit back. As Guy, you said in your book, you said some people just sit back and they watch the revolution on TV. I'm not one of those, and I've had people from other channels. They pull the same shit. They're the ones who keep bitching and bitching and bitching and watching this shit, but they're not willing to jump off the fence and take a stand. And if it means giving up something, you do it to get there. We know that Guy's Prius is going to leave some ecological trail of disaster for something, but it's a lot better than having a Bentley. And that's what I'm saying.
Well, and I said final. I never final until I walk away.
No, he's far from done, believe me.
Both of you gentlemen made such important points in different ways, and I'd like to just chime in on it. Even when you're doomed, I think what both of you are kind of saying, if you are Guy, you kind of said, if you can wrap your head around, what may happen, it frees you up to do things to keep it from happening. I think that's very true. All right, Brian, you kind of said, no matter what, you do that. And I'm going to carry it kind of a third way. If you can't have hope and faith, and that's something you either have or you don't, and it's a variable that can come, you still can't give up. There's something wonderfully human, about Don Quixote, going against those windmills, or Atticus Finch, still representing Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird fiction. Yes, but we see it all the time. Whether it's real people, fictional people, the situation is bad, but they just, Brian, as you said, they don't sit back and bitch. They don't sit back and moan. They say, okay, and I think even greater are those who say, I know I won't get it in my time, but I'm not working for my time. And this is the end of my time. You guys continue the show. Brian, go for the record. I'll check back in at 4 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I hope you guys are still talking.
This is what's, Guy, this is what's called a Jewish family exit. It never ends.
I could almost drop the mic tonight. Watch everybody, my headphones.
Okay. Judy, throw him out. And anyway, Guy, what I did want to ask you is, I did read What Comes Next, if you remember when I first interviewed you, and I did read, and it's good reading. You can read it in 2 hours if anybody's interested. But would you please tell everybody what your website is, or where they can get a hold of this?
So all of the books and everything that I work on links from guylane.com. Guylane.com. Yeah, guylane.com. And so Motel Prius just went up the other day. That's the yellow cover with the car on it. And so I've basically I've got fiction novels, and in the last year or so I've started writing I've coined a term called semi-fiction. So Motel Prius has got sort of 4 strands running through it. It's got a narrative about the guy called Guy who's moving from one place to the next and driving around the countryside trying to find a place to have a permanent base in Australia. And then it's the narrative about COVID. There's a narrative about climate and collapse. And then there's the narrative about Vita religion. So I'm trying to sort of braided all of those 3 things together. So there's fiction and non-fiction elements, I call it semi-fiction. And what I've been doing as well is I've been writing these books so that they're short. Like you mentioned, you could read what comes next in 2 hours.
Right. This
one's shorter still.
Right.
And so it packs a lot in basically about a bit over an hour's reading. And the physical books are actually produced 4x6, so they fit in your pocket. So you can actually carry it around with you in your pocket. And so it's like a pocket book that you can read quickly. And what we're thinking of doing is to actually put in the front of the book, the first 6 pages or so, is have basically blank pages with lines inviting people to buy a copy and then to pass it on. So less a book that sits
And you
on
can
the
walk by
shelf,
the
and
camera. I've still got it on,
and
but
more
it's not on
and more a book that goes around in
Show it.
circulation
Mm-hmm.
as a way of sharing the ideas further.
Dave, shut the hell up. I can still hear you.
Oh, it's fun.
Okay. But in any case, okay, so just go to guylane.com. And again, I've read a couple of your books, and they are very easy to read, and they're very entertaining. I found them very funny. It's the dialogue that you have. I think you had one of them where, when you were talking about the Vita religion, some guy reacts in the same way that you would expect, and you're very honest about it. You know what I mean? So it is extremely interesting, and it was fun. If anything, for me, it was a fun read. It really, like you said, it's less than 2 hours. And it made a lot of sense, and it's funny because I like to dress in black too, by the way. So okay, that's
this is the official attire of the Veton minister is the black T-shirt and the pendant.
Yeah, you took, like you said, a Dremel, and you cut those out or whatever.
No, so this is laser cut stainless steel.
Okay.
But they comes with rough edges, so you've got to use the Dremel to cut the edges down. Yeah, right. and it's on a stainless steel wire with a magnetic clasp. Mm-hmm. So this wire is 1 mil stainless, but I've got to find a 0.8 mil. I think is what we need. So the idea was to create this piece of jewelry that we could sell as a way of bringing some money into the just to fund operations.
Well, that's
fund what we're doing.
It's a wonderful shape. I really like it. It's very, very nice. So anyway, Guy, I would like to thank you. Again, I can't thank you enough for being on, because you really are an interesting guest, and I know climate is generally more your topic than anything else, but I'm in awe of your political acumen, and it's always an interesting discussion when we discuss politics with you, because you not only know about Australian politics, but you certainly keep up with what's going on in the United States, and you do understand why we've made this channel, because again, we are not big supporters of Joe Biden in the sense that we like him, but it's a pragmatic choice, and we just had to do it. So you're welcome to come on anytime, Guy, and we hope to see you again.
Yep.
And all I can say is thank you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on, and I'll be happy to come back.
And one last thing, I'm not sure. You said that you were born in England, but you of course lived in Brisbane for most of your life, or in Australia. So are you a dual citizen? Are you actually Australian, or what is it?
So I came out to Australia from England when I was 9 weeks old, went back to the UK at age 7, and then came back to Australia at 15. So I'm a dual national. In Australia, I'm referred to as a POM, which is a British-born Australian. But I identify as Australian. I've got an Australian passport, but I've also got an expired British passport, which I believe I can I'm a dual national.
But you've lost your English accent, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of my life I've been in Australia, so so
naturally you would have.
I'm a POM. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, Guy, thank you much. And again, contact me if you want to be on again, because we'd love to have you on again. Great. Really, it's wonderful. Yeah. So take care of yourself, Guy, and keep that hotel in good shape. It's been good to you.
Motel.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Guy. And I didn't hear the what's it called, the minor bird this time, so I guess he's gone. All right. We'll see you, Guy.
Okay,
bye.